I'm Shannon LeGros. I host a podcast called Into the Fray. And for most of my life, I've been capturing history in a bottle. No, not the history that we all grew up learning about in school or reading about in the newspaper, but the weird stuff, the bizarre, the strange. I collect eyewitness stories of people who've encountered the unreal. And today begins my own search for one of the biggest questions I've ever asked. Are we alone? So here's the deal. Unless you've been blissfully living under a rock for the last decade, you're probably aware that the world has gone crazy. Politics, societal unrest, poverty, global relationships, it's all in flux. Social media has made it easier than ever to express our disdain for each other, while television news is a non-stop war on any sense of well-being we may have otherwise managed to convince ourselves of. Wars are being waged across the Middle East, while inner cities remain an ignored battleground on our home soil. In the last year, the U.S. Navy admitted they were aware of aerial phenomena that remains unidentifiable. Former members of secret government-sanctioned organizations who studied the UFO subject have come forward, positioning the phenomenon as one of the go-to topics of discussion for news anchors, radio hosts, and late-night talk shows alike. Pop culture is full of aliens, while television execs have embraced the newfound popularity by blanketing networks and shows about men and women hunting flying saucers. Where UFO debates used to rage in cavernous forums hiding in the darkened recesses of the internet, today the verbal battles erupt on Facebook and Twitter. Somewhere in the middle of all this newfound attention, something has been lost. I no longer see the excitement over the unknown that once inspired so many to look up to the skies. When the US government is actively telling you that UFOs are real, what's the sense in being curious about anything? I don't consider myself a ufologist or a researcher or even an investigator. I collect stories. When I was just a kid, I had something happen to me that I found hard to explain or rationalize. I had no one to really talk to about it. I started wondering if maybe there were other people out there like me. Other people who had witnessed something beyond the norm who had no one they could share their experience with. That's what set me on the path I'm on today. I've been fascinated by strange objects in the sky for ages now, since I was little, and yet I've never encountered one for myself. Over the next year, I'll be traveling the country along with the documentary team from Small Town Monsters in search of stories, and maybe a few answers to some of my questions. While there are a number of spooky, creepy stories about encounters with little green men littering ufology, it's not what drives me. I'm driven by curiosity and by a desire to learn more about the people who see these things. People like Dan Weese.
Nice to meet you.
So I guess walk us through the story sort of from the beginning.
Okay. It's a warm summer night. My sister Stacy, she's a few years older than I am. She says, let's go for a walk. So we take a walk and we go around the block here. Here's the house. We just go around the block and we go over here one street over and we start heading down this hill and we can see Belgrade Gardens out here to the, to my right, and there's this big tree line behind there. And suddenly we saw it, and it's just like they describe in books and videos, it's like a saucer. And it seems so crazy, but this thing's huge. And it's coming from the south. It's kind of higher up on the tree level, the tree line. It's coming from the south, it's kind of moving to the north, and it's coming down slowly as it goes. Talking on the phone with my sister Lindy last night, like I said, she was so ecstatic about it, like more into the story than I was. I said it was covered in lights, right? And I go, you know what it actually looked like was that ride at the fair. It's called the rotor. You ever hear of that? You get in, it spins super fast, and you stick to the walls. I said that ride looked like a spaceship because that's how they designed it to look like. So, and it's covered in lights. And she goes, that's exactly what it looked like. Put that on a winch and threw it in the sky for a few minutes. I don't know.
Was there lights on, around the whole thing on the top of the dome and as well as underneath?
No, I think it was, I don't think there was lights, at least from my point of view. I don't think there was lights on top or bottom. I think it was just, you got just in the, I think it was in my field of vision for 6 to 8 seconds. So it was relatively slow moving. And it had kind of a humming noise, like a light humming noise, It's just covered in lights. It seems so silly it would be covered in lights, Just everything's exactly how people describe it, seeing a UFO. But I think what gets me the most is whenever I've looked up videos or images of UFOs, I really don't ever see anything like I saw. Usually it's like, the video will be like a series of lights way far out, like you can't see any detail or anything, and they're here and they're gone. But this thing was clear and present, and it was just, and it just slowly moved below the tree line and it was gone.
Dan has been keeping this story to himself for almost 30 years. In that span of time, the cultural landscape has changed in so many ways. Pop culture has elevated UFOs into a position where they're never far from our minds, and yet, the reality of what an actual encounter is like has been ignored. In the last 2 years, the subject has been thrust into greater prominence thanks to major news stories, an expanding lineup of television shows covering the topic, and the number of celebrities and political figures who have involved themselves in the debate. These days, few people are looking to the skies, though, to satisfy their curiosity, and instead have turned to personalities and figures for answers. A far cry from the earliest days of UFO research. But what brought us to where we are today?
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. Well, thanks for asking.
And I'm going to have my phone out, but I'm not texting. I'm reading.
Alejandro Rojas
Okay.
is a journalist who covers pop culture, science fiction, and outer space-based topics, with a focus on UFOs and the search for extraterrestrial life. His focus at openminds.tv is to cover the full breadth of the subject and to objectively report on the latest news.
How do you see, what's the biggest sort of difference between where the UFO world or where the UFO subject sits today compared to where it was, say, like 20, 30, 40 years ago?
20, 30, 40 years ago? Well, 20 years ago or so, when I first got into this, it was kind of a low point for UFOs. It wasn't taken as seriously or covered as much. Not like today, where we're in a very, very unique situation where the government's talking about UFOs, the president has been talking about UFOs in a serious manner. The credibility level of the subject is at a high point, higher than it's been in a long time.
David Weatherly is located in my hometown of Las Vegas. He's a paranormal historian who has written a number of books on a massive array of strange subjects. He's extremely knowledgeable about the UFO topic and its history.
Modern ufology, and when I say modern, I mean probably the last 10 years, it's taken some very curious twists and turns. When we look at the modern state of things now, the paranormal in general has become part of pop culture. This is because of the rash of ghost hunting shows, UFO shows that are on television. So all of a sudden, we reached a point where all of these topics become much more acceptable and a bit less taboo. What has happened in the midst of this evolution in recent years is that not only has the study of UFOs, the topic of UFOs, become something that's culturally acceptable, but a lot of other people have come out into the open in the midst of that. We have an amazing array of scientists, of military officers, law enforcement, a whole range of people who are coming forward and either saying, yes, I've had an encounter, or, you know, there's something much more to this topic than meets the eye and it bears further study.
Ronald Regier isn't just a UFO investigator. He's a bona fide rocket scientist who has worked for Douglas Aircraft, which became McDonnell Douglas prior to becoming Boeing. He was part of the team that launched the Saturn Apollo moon rocket, and later, his position as an engineer made him aware of radar pings for unusual aerial phenomena such as the Iran UFO in 1974 and the Phoenix Lights. Ronald was also employed at a secure area in Nevada, which is tied to the infamous Area 51, known as S4. Later, he would become the state director for one of the largest organizations looking into UFOs, the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON.
How do you feel about the sort of change in ufology from maybe where it was like 30, 40 years ago to where it is today? How do you see the subject changing, maybe in the public view?
There's more acceptance of the phenomenon now. We're getting back to where it's a serious subject, and that may be because of Reagan's mentioning it 7 times in speeches, and I think Bill Clinton mentioned a couple of times.
Do you think that makes it easier for witnesses to come forward, or, you know, because of the ridicule factor maybe being lessened?
Yeah, as long as it's not a ridicule. I've had a lot of witnesses who did not want to talk about it. They wanted to talk to somebody that it would be kept strictly confidential, and that's why it was so important for us to maintain confidentiality.
If there's one characteristic that marked the last 80 years of the subject, it was probably the way experiencers have been greeted with ridicule, consternation, or been simply ignored. In the earliest days of ufology, many witnesses were met with a genuine interest and even excitement by family, friends, and even members of the press. That changed very quickly, however, when a scientific committee was formed at the behest of the Central Intelligence Agency who, more than anything, wanted the subject of flying saucers to simply go away. This kicked off what would become a pattern for the government's handling of the topic for decades to follow, and indirectly or directly may have helped form the basis for the treatment of witnesses. While the Robertson Panel and subsequent projects such as Blue Book did their utmost to debunk reports of unidentified objects, they also helped to further the false impression that witnesses are few and far between, and more often than not, are just misidentifying mundane craft or naturally occurring atmospheric conditions. Despite their best efforts, though, people have learned that strange aerial phenomena are being seen around the world by ordinary people on a daily basis. Dan Weese doesn't seem afraid of ridicule, but it's taken him decades to understand that what happened to him is part of something much bigger.
Is it important to you that it's documented in some way, or is it more like whatever, you know, like I'm gonna have it with me forever because it's my story?
I think it's important as so much as that it'd be nice to know if there's anyone else who saw something similar, or if they do in the future, you can point back to this and say, okay, we've seen it before. But I mean, that tree right there, that big one that's taking up most of the view, we could have been right here.
Yeah.
But maybe that tree, 25 years removed is just a lot. It'd have to be, right? Same with the big pine.
So it's straight ahead.
Yeah.
Can we pull into that parking lot over there?
We right in the corner area, there was like a path and you go in.
How did you all feel about seeing it? I mean, were you
Well, I ran in the
scared?
house. Like I said, we come around from over there. We came back around the road, ran into our older sister, second sister that saw this. And she said, yeah, I had seen it. And we talked to the neighbor of ours, older yet, and he had been jogging. And he said certainly he had seen it too. I ran in the house, and I remember my dad was on the couch right in the main room there. And I woke him up out of his sleep. I said, you'll never believe what we saw. You know, of course, you're telling your 40-year-old dad that you just saw a UFO, and he said, why did you wake me up?
Is that pretty much really what he
Pretty
said?
much, yeah.
Yeah.
Ryan Sprague is an investigator and author who lives in New York City. Ryan and I started out together as hosts on my show, Into the Fray. Eventually, he struck out on his own and now hosts his own podcast called Somewhere in the Skies, which was also the title of his first book on the subject. Ryan was also featured on a recent CW television series about the paranormal, but has since returned to independently investigating and researching UFOs.
For decades, UFO researchers have been trying to make what we do validated, make it legitimate. And we always went to the government for that, which is good and bad. I always found it fascinating that UFO people never believe the government, but the minute they come forward and say, hey, UFOs are real, we acknowledge they're real, we're so quick to just accept that. But the fact that the New York Times broke this story and we found out that there was a secret program, we all thought it ended with Project Blue Book.
It was this guy, Lou Elizondo, who was investigating UFOs or researching them at the Pentagon. He's a career intelligence officer. He got hooked up with people in the government who have been working in the paranormal arena for decades. They were working together to essentially investigate UFOs for the government.
Even us in the UFO community had no idea that this program existed, and that they actually brought evidence to the table to show us these pretty captivating videos, I thought, the Tic Tac UFO in specific.
In 2004, off the coast of San Diego, there was an encounter by the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group. They were catching on radar these objects. At one point, they zero in some jets on the objects. One of the jets approaches the object. They saw some, water churning. Above that water was an object he said was about 40 feet long. It was white, smooth, lozenge sort of shape. He even calls it a tic-tac. It looked like a giant flying tic-tac. He maneuvered toward this thing, and this thing began to match his maneuvers. It was starting to get behind him, which is a position you don't want if you're a fighter pilot, so he moved to get in front of this object, and the object took off at incredible speeds.
The fact is, the government has been actively involved in the UFO game going all the way back to the 1940s. In 1952, Project Blue Book was the name given to the Air Force-operated study into the UFO phenomenon, which was advised by J. Allen Hynek, an American astronomer and professor. Blue Book continued into the late 1960s before it was shuttered, but it's theorized that the Air Force, along with other branches of the military and the United States government, continued investigating the subject. In 2017, Luis Elizondo confirmed these suspicions by breaking his silence on the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP. Elizondo left the secretive government-sanctioned group, went public about its existence, and then joined an enterprise called To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, which counted many former and some current government officials and scientific minds. But the fact that To the Stars counted so many political figures amongst its ranks acted as a red flag for many enthusiasts and historians alike. But there might be more to this story than simply a secret government-sanctioned look into whether or not little green men are visiting Earth. And Greg Bishop is just one of the people who has reason to question the existing stories about ATIP.
TTSA was formed in, I believe, October of 2017. They had a press conference. Tom DeLonge, former guitarist, songwriter from Blink-182, he apparently got in touch with a bunch of people, former and maybe present government people, military, intelligence, and for some reason they saw something in him and decided that maybe they could form some kind of organization that would be a private UFO study, information gathering, basically a media empire to support itself so they could do this UFO research. That was their story.
Right now, Elizondo, who worked for the Pentagon investigating UFOs, he left and joined this group To the Stars, ran by rock star Tom DeLonge.
So now we have a situation where in recent weeks even, there have been all these revelations from government officials. We've heard about ATIP, we've heard about the fact that the Navy is looking at UFOs.
They gathered together people from different parts of the government, I think all retired, all in intelligence and military intelligence and some military. The important part of their mission that they stated, I mean, it's totally public, is they're trying to find out what is going on with the UFO subject to see if any part of the technology or the apparent technology can be exploited for profit defense, both. And as far as anybody knows, that's what that's what they're doing. I think they're doing far more than that, and they're not going to talk about it, but that's what everybody does. You do anything, you don't tell everybody anything, all that you're doing, because then you can't do whatever you're going to do.
You know, their look at some of these significant cases involving military accounts and so forth is really changing, I think, how the public in general looks at UFOs. And it's interesting to me because, you know, for years there's been a disclosure movement. But come on, if the government came out tomorrow and said, we're going to disclose everything about UFOs in a press conference, it's going to take 1 hour, would you really believe that they were doing that? It's going to be pretty fascinating to see where things go from here, because I think there's been so much attention put on the topic of UFOs now that we've finally reached a zenith point where we can't really go back. You know, we can't suddenly close the curtain and say, no, never mind, nothing was going on. They did that with Blue Book, but it worked back then. It won't work now.
So we have a celebrity rock star heading up what could very well become the impetus for disclosure. It's strange for sure, but far from the weirdest thing to ever happen to the field of UFO study. In my short time involved in all of this, I've come to see a dramatic shift in the way people react to one another online. Whether it's the number of former government officials involved or the murkiness of what their true agenda might be, To the Stars Academy is creating a debate. But why debate the true merits and motives of a group of scientists, politicians, and celebrities at all? Isn't this simply shifting the focus away from where it should be to begin with? The further one wades into the current state of the UFO field, the more it seems to me that there is a disconnect between the people who have actually encountered a UFO and the personalities, agendas, and gossip that has built up around the subject.
The peer review used to be people talking to each other in journals. Now it's fighting on social media. That's basically ufology now, at least most of it. Just people yelling at each other on social media and arguing about stuff that's probably not that important.
The ridicule factor has played a very large role in keeping people quiet. A large reason why they don't at least publicly engage in this sort of topic is because they're afraid of the ridicule factor and this hurting their credibility. And so often scientists will remain anonymous. And the issue with that is, even though individual scientists may be interested, scientists are not the ones with the big bank role. They're not the people with all the instrumentation. These are organizations and institutions. And those are the people who have to want to be able to get involved in order to put all these resources towards figuring something out.
It's exciting. I think for a lot of us, it's a new shift in how the public overall looks at UFOs.
What is that, the shift?
I think the public's perception of the UFO phenomenon is now acknowledgement that UFOs exist. That had been a question for so long. Just getting the government to say that, they would never do that. And then boom, out of nowhere, it happens. They said UFOs exist. Now the question is, I think, what are they? Who's in control of them? And most importantly, I think, what do they want?
You get an understanding of what the phenomenon is doing and what it's about by dealing with people that it's affected. That gives you an insight into what's going on. Just trying to heal them and help them and listen and be sympathetic, that's a huge part of the ufology thing that nobody's really talked about. It's not argued about on forums or anything, but the element of, what happens to people, how does it affect them, and how do they, if they need to, recover from it. I want to talk to them about what happened later. I want to talk to them about how it made them feel. I want to talk to them about how it changed their lives. And I want to talk to them about how they feel about it now and if they've been able to go on with life. Because I think, one, that helps the person, which is the most important thing. And two, like I said, it gives you an insight into the phenomenon that you wouldn't have had before. And that oblique insight is a lot more important than, to me, than what color was it, how fast did it go, what direction did it go. Who cares about that stuff? That could be interesting, but we have tons of data. Nobody's really done anything with it, at least that gives us any answers. So maybe the answers lie in the interaction between people and the phenomenon itself.
Do you, even at your own house though, do you still sometimes look up and, did it ignite any kind of an interest in this more so than maybe think you would have had?
Yeah, I'm always interested in, I don't know if I should say space travel or something, but I'm always interested in space. And I do look up in the sky, and she's calling now. I do look up in the sky and say, wow, how cool it would be if I could see something like that again.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for calling me back.
Sure.
So, telling him how I'm a little unsure of what I had seen. How cool it was that you had seen it too, being older, that it kind of reassured me in what I was thinking I'd saw,
Yeah, that makes sense.
Would you have a second to kind of tell me what you saw? Because they're actually recording too, and I thought it'd be cool. It makes the story so much more credible when you have someone else telling it,
I had just gone for a walk around the block and I was by myself. I was headed up the road and I saw something that looked very much like a typical UFO with lights, and it was just a quick something out of the corner of my eye, and I thought, that's crazy. That, I couldn't explain what else it was though, and I kind of shrugged it off. And then you and Stacy were walking towards me maybe 3 or 4 minutes later, and she was all worked up and said that you guys had just seen a UFO. And I said, well, I saw something also, but I don't know what it was. But I laughed and thought that's kind of what I thought it was too. And I was trying to talk all of us out of thinking that's what it was when a complete stranger jogging by overheard us and said, no, she's right and you're right. I saw it also. Well, I immediately started to, in my own head, my first reaction was, what the heck was that? That looked like a UFO. And then I thought to myself, you're an idiot. Those things aren't real.
Right.
And I kind of laughed to myself. But then when Stacy was all worked up, I started thinking, we really did see something. But it is hard to remember details. It's been 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something that I've never forgotten. And occasionally, I have brought it up and shared with my friends that, there was this one time where a few of us saw something.
Right, so have I. Do you ever, when you look at the sky, because every now and then I look, especially when I go past this area, I kind of think real quick oh, it'd be cool if I just saw something. Or do you ever wonder if there is something back there, maybe there's some underground thing where they keep these things, or do you think it was government, or what do you think?
No, late at night, if there's a plane and you catch a flashing light, sometimes it triggers that memory.
Uh-huh.
Because planes at night have different color lights and that sort of thing.
Well, thanks for letting me talk to you about it. I appreciate you, because like I said, without someone else's testimony, I'm kind of out here pointing at the sky and I'm like, yep, saw it. But when you have someone else, especially someone who was older, especially considering I was only 9 years old, it helps bring a lot of credibility to the story and everything.
No, we all saw something. So I really couldn't be certain what it was, but we all saw something that day.
I think so too. All right, thanks, Lindy.
Okay, no
Talk to you
problem.
later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
I guess if there's one thing I've learned so far, it's to start putting the focus back on the people. Not just the people who are investigating or researching, but the people who have had experiences with something they don't understand. Lost in all the hype over Navy tic tacs and media empires are the witness experiences and the motivations behind the people who look into these subjects. This time, I'm not just attempting to prove to myself that UFOs exist, and for once, I'm not simply collecting stories. I'm gathering data from as many sources as possible, in as many ways as I can. When it's all over, I hope I can look back at a year-long trek across the US and have some answers to the questions that so many people have become too distracted to ask. Coming up on the next episode of On the Trail of UFOs.
The oldest sightings I'm aware of are probably in the 1700s.
There's lights and a delta formation like this, and it's just a pitch black craft, perfect equilateral triangle.
The last report I received was from a Boeing crewman and saw one of these mile-wide craft hovering over their tarmac.
Funny thing about UFOs, they're always changing, while perpetually remaining the same. The earliest documented reports of strange objects in the sky essentially define them similarly to early descriptions of flying saucers. In the 1600s, reports of strange lights off the coast of the Americas define some of the earliest known types of UFO sightings, while in the 1700s, settlers in the New England areas recalled descriptions of hovering orbs in the skies above the waterways around Boston. Today, it's not just flying saucers or lights in the sky that experiencers encounter. Cigar-shaped craft, tic-tacs from space, and yes, the black triangles. Triangular-shaped craft began gaining notoriety during the 1980s, when a wave of sightings swept across the Hudson Valley, but it wasn't until 1997 that the national media began focusing on them.
My name is Lynn D. Kitai, MD. I am a medical doctor, had no interest or knowledge in this topic at all till what would become the most historic, most documented, and the most important mass anomalous aerial sighting in modern history, if not all of history, called the Phoenix Lights. My husband and I are physicians, and healthy skeptics, one must be when you're a physician. We had a very close sighting to our home. We live mountainside in Paradise Valley, pretty high on the mountain, and have a panoramic view of the city skyline, so we know what planes look like and helicopters and streetlights and so forth. These phenomena were very different than anything we'd ever seen before. In fact, my husband called me to one wall of our bedroom is a window, so we see whatever pops up out there. And he noticed that there were 3 amber orbs a little below us over a very treacherous desert landscape. We live in a gated community nestled in the mountains, so there is no way that it could have been military. And here, these 3 orbs in a pyramid formation, 1 on top and 2 underneath, were just hovering there. And most people that have these anomalous experiences don't move, they're in awe. And I wanted to take everything in mentally, the size, the shape, the color. These orbs were about 3 to 6 feet each, depending on how close they were. They were actually oval shaped, like an egg on its side, or like what Navy pilots are now describing as tic-tac shape. It was a uniform amber color throughout, and it didn't glare at all. Every other light out there glared. And my husband calls me back, he says, "Get over here quick, one of them is disappearing." And as we both watched in awe, the top orb, without budging from the other 2 underneath, started to implode shrink, almost like a dimmer switch, getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Dr. Kitai's sighting would be the first of 3 that culminated with the mass sighting on March 13th of what would become widely known as the Phoenix Lights incident. Between 1995 and 1997, Lynn would begin studying the UFO subject and paid closer attention to the sky above her desert home. Lynn's next sighting would occur in January 1997, 2 months prior to the Phoenix anomaly. But what she witnessed that night bears close similarities to the craft that would make its way overhead in March later that same year.
I was lying in bed and I happened to notice 3 huge amber orbs, but at a distance, far west. And I thought, wait a minute, they're amber, they're in a line formation, equidistant from each other. They're hovering for moments, minutes, which is ironic because 2 months later, thousands of people who saw the Phoenix Lights phenomena on March 13, 1997, would describe them as 5 lights in a V formation with 2 trailing. But this was 2 months before. And I watched as each one imploded. They seemed to shrink from right to left, and they were gone.
Now, triangles and tic-tacs are weird enough, but the history of unidentified objects in the US goes back further than most people realize. In researching the UFO subject, I found a string of reports of unidentified craft which hovered over major cities and small towns alike, seemingly wanting to be seen. Sound familiar? No, this wasn't the Phoenix Lights or any number of other modern-day mass sighting events. It was the Great Airship Waves, and they occurred well over a century ago. To start to understand the full scope of what is being seen overhead today, it's almost a necessity to take a look back at what people were seeing in the past. To look back through American history, there's probably no better place to start than New England. And there's few as schooled in the history of strange objects in the sky than Linda Zimmerman. Linda is a researcher and author located in upstate New York, who has written a number of books on UFOs, particularly of sightings and encounters in the Hudson Valley area. Linda's knowledge of the UFO subject comes from a lifelong interest in the phenomenon and from decades' worth of experience interviewing witnesses.
The oldest sightings I'm aware of are probably in the 1700s, colonial accounts of strange objects in the sky. Certainly by the 1800s, there were a lot. The biggest, earliest wave that I've been able to find was 1908, 1909. The mysterious airships, as they called them, they weren't called UFOs yet, but these were enormous craft that could hover. They could fly at an extremely high rate of speed and carried 1 to 3 extremely bright spotlights. There simply were no craft that we mere mortals had at that point that had those flight characteristics. Didn't exist.
These cases are just incredible. I remember reading about them years ago. They dubbed them airships. So in the 1890s, there was this whole outbreak of sightings and encounters that people were having with airships. They didn't know what else to call them. And they actually looked like, for me, it kind of evokes sort of a steampunk version of a Zeppelin or something, because you read these cases and these people are talking about these massive ships. Sometimes there's different kind of gears and fins and things like that on them. They see these crafts, sometimes they land, sometimes they encounter the occupants.
A lot of them were described as balloons or zephyrs or that sort of thing, although dirigibles of this type were not very popular, especially not here in the United States. There was a little bit of research into that, but most of that was going on in Europe.
In the area where I live in the southern Hudson Valley, there were sightings many, many nights. Farmers would be out commenting on these enormous bright lights, like as if they were searching for something. Worcester, Massachusetts, in Christmas of 1909, tens of thousands of people were just spilling out of their homes and businesses to see the mysterious airships that sometimes would circle overhead for hours and hours.
You get these farmers and people living in rural areas who really just don't know what to think. All of a sudden there's this flying craft. You can imagine what that was like in the late 1800s, you know, well before airplanes and so forth. Suddenly there are these huge ships that are coming down from somewhere.
One night there was a sighting. It went as far from New York City to Boston in a single night, witnesses all along the way. So these were just long, sustained flights.
These are some of the earliest cases that we get. This whole rash of airship sightings and encounters are sort of a subset of the identifications of UFOs.
When you see these stunning reports, basically from here to Canada and out to the Midwest over a 2-year period, how else do you explain that?
When people were seeing that sort of thing here in the United States, I think that really was a genuine mystery.
When we get into later periods, of course, descriptions get somewhat more consistent, but only to a degree.
Dean Merchant is something of a ufological historian. He's based in New Hampshire, not far from the site of one of the more famous encounter stories near Exeter. It's apparent that his love of the subject has placed him in a unique position as a gatekeeper for information that others might otherwise let slip through the cracks.
So Kenneth Arnold was a really cool part of the UFO history. He was a pilot himself. He saw, might have been 7 craft, and I'd have to check on that, but he saw the craft and he kind of chased after them and got a very good look at them. He knew that this was something that was not basically of this world. He came back and reported them, and he talked about them, tried to describe how they acted, and he said if you could picture a saucer skipping on the water, and that kind of was coined. But actually, you know, a lot of them seen odd disc shapes. These were more of the wing, like the B-2 stealth bomber, which interests me. They had that kind of flying wing shape that he saw. At that time, this became a great interest for the press. You know, the movie genre was going to be starting soon. All of this stuff was milling around, you know, post-World War II, just about to hit the early 50s. So there's a lot of interest with the media.
Stan Gordon has been taking reports of UFOs in the state of Pennsylvania since the 1960s. In that time, he's become known as the go-to source of information relating to anomalous phenomena on the western edge of the state, and he's authored multiple books on a number of strange subjects. He's also spent decades researching a purported crash of one of America's many supposed crashed unknown objects near the village of Kecksburg, which makes him a very valuable resource when it comes to identifying trends, if they exist, in craft descriptions.
Well, of course, going back many, many years, and you still get some of these reports, you had your typical big disc. And I can tell you during the 1960s, there were many, many incidents here in Pennsylvania of very large structured metallic objects, big discs, many with portholes in it, very low to the ground.
There's a common accepted idea of the flying saucer, that literally looks like maybe a pair of plates, or a saucer if you turned it upside down that's flying. And a lot of people were reporting those types of crafts.
And there were landing reports. In fact, there was one that happened only miles from where we're sitting years ago. Probably one of my favorite stories. Unfortunately, both witnesses are now deceased. They were two brothers. It was February 1968. The older brother gets married in February 68, and he and his new wife, they rent a small farmhouse not far from here. One afternoon, I look out the window, about 50 feet off the ground, there's this huge metallic dome-shaped object with portals like a catwalk hovering right there. He can't believe what he's seeing. He steps outside, he calls his wife, and as they're looking at this thing, these small little humanoid creatures come out on the catwalk, like communicating with each other, and they look directly at them. It's starting to snow. He goes back in the house, he calls his brother in Greensburg, who believed in this. He and his wife come out. When they get there, it's still there, but it's about 100 feet off the ground. It's starting to snow pretty good, and as they watch this thing, suddenly it shoots off across the sky into the heavens, looks like a red star crossing the sky, and disappears. And they called the local airport, and they said, you're one of many people calling in and report the same thing.
There would be variations on them. Sometimes they would have windows along the sides, sometimes a window on the top or a dome.
1930s, we started getting circular craft, your classic flying saucers. Certainly that was the model of choice in the 40s and 50s and early 60s.
But then we have all these other variations of these ships. The cigar shape is another one that was really reported quite often initially, and that was this idea that it was a larger craft. We're going back to that balloon type of shape or Zeppelin type of shape, but it's more of a metallic looking cigar shape.
We have many reports for years and years of the big metallic cigar-shaped object, including, as we're filming here in the last week, some very detailed sightings up in Cambria County, where something like this is being seen by independent observers 100 feet, 200 feet off the ground. Very close-range reports coming in.
Do you notice, and I don't know if this is just me, but do you notice a weird sort of correlation between UFO descriptions and the era in which they're taking place technologically?
So there are phases that go on. The typical flying saucer, the round disc-shaped object that we saw so much in the 50s, seemed to be, more of something that was happening during that era. And we haven't seen so much since then. So there are kind of trends that seem to happen here and there.
Gee whiz.
In the midst of that, we also had craft that resembled a little bit closer to the bomber, the stealth bomber.
Then the triangles, V's, and boomerangs of the 1980s. The signature events of the waves of the 1980s were triangular-shaped craft that almost always were described as the size of a football field, would descend down to treetop level. I had people tell me they could have hit it with a baseball, a rock, a tennis ball. That's how close these were.
Larger craft that were reported, for instance, in the Phoenix Lights, these massive, I hesitate to use the word almost, but motherships, as some people dubbed them.
Absolutely silent. Most people said eerily quiet, dead silent. One witness said it was like a city of lights. Hundreds and hundreds of multicolored lights.
Triangles were something new. That wasn't something as abundant as it has been more recently. Although these triangle sightings have been going on for quite some time, but it just seems like more.
So again, the ability to hover in place for extremely long periods of time and then shoot off in the blink of an eye. There was one man that impressed me in particular, Mike Hartnett. He actually became one of the highest ranking members of the New York City Fire Department. This was not a skittish man at all, and he had one of these massive triangles move very, very slowly over his house. And being one of New York's bravest, he got a very bright, like million candle power light, and he flashed it at this object, and in response, all of its lights dimmed and then came back on in direct response to him.
Sean Kevin Jason witnessed a black triangle for himself on a desert road somewhere between Las Vegas and Rachel, Nevada. Sean has spent the time following his sighting, further exploring the subject, and fully admits he hopes to have another encounter. What Sean witnessed, though, is distinctly different from the Phoenix Lights phenomenon or the typical triangular-shaped UFO craft descriptions, and his theories as to what was piloting the craft make his sighting stand out.
It was a slow night. Business was slow. Jumped on the highway, headed out of town until I hit the Apex exit. Got off at Apex, where you head on 93, Highway 93, heading towards Area 51. Right when I'm getting to the end of that turn, off in the distance, I see these lights. By this time, it was right around 10 o'clock. I see the lights off ahead, and I think, okay, there's another car heading my way. Didn't think anything of it at first, and continued driving. I was a little concerned because, this was the time before cell phones, that sort of thing. So if someone's in trouble, am I gonna stop to help them? So I'm driving a little ways thinking about this when it dawned on me that the lights were not on the road, they're hovering over the road. Because I can see the lights over the road, and then I can see the illuminated road underneath these lights. So I had a pair of binoculars with me, and I decided to try to get a view of the craft through my binoculars as I'm driving. I'm trying to drive while I'm using them at the same time. I can definitely see the lights better with the binoculars and tell something for sure is over the road. So I had tossed the binoculars in my back seat and decided to just floor it. Push the car as fast as I could to get there before this craft leaves. It didn't take long at all before I found myself pulling up underneath the craft and parking my car. There's lights and a delta formation like this, and it's just a pitch black craft, perfect equilateral triangle. It was hovering roughly around 20 feet over the road, completely silent, making no noise at all. The craft was actually darker than the sky behind it. I'm sitting there and just dumbfounded, in awe. At one point I decided to pinch my arm, just kind of like, am I really awake? Is this really happening? And I had done so hard that I wanted to draw blood from my arm. So I'm thinking if I can grab my binoculars, I might be able to make out any logo or identification. I had thrown them in the back seat, so I turn around, see them right away. They were lying on the floor behind the passenger seat, grabbed them, turned back around, and the craft is gone. And I'm thinking at this point, it's totally gone. I'm not gonna see it again. So I start scanning the horizon. I catch it again to my 7 o'clock position, and it actually got a good ways down the valley from me, and just that short period of time. Like I said, it was flying to the 7 o'clock position, and then it made a right, heading, basically north towards the mountains. It was just a bizarre thing to see as this thing slowly crept up the side of the mountain, and you see it hit the top, and then it just drops down the other side of it.
So today, we know that a number of early sightings of triangular-shaped craft might be written off as stealth bombers undergoing testing, particularly in the western part of the country. It doesn't account, however, for the large number of sightings in recent years, and certainly can't account for the sightings of craft that seem to be city-sized. Still, more recently, the face of the phenomena continues to change, and this is evidenced in the abbreviation used by many within the research community, changing from UFO for unidentified flying object to UAP for unidentified aerial phenomena. Tic Tacs and craft referred to as gimbals are being seen in the skies, and the further along we come, the more obvious it is that we're leaving behind the days of only reports of the classic flying saucers. But, like the old adage goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
So you got all these different reports from so many different people. Just like the sighting last week in Cambria County. I got the first report that evening from a witness who saw this thing very low, very foggy area. big, solid, cigar-shaped object, but he said the entire object was glowing and luminous, not separate windows. It was completely luminous. He said it would suddenly fade out and disappear, reappear again, fade out and disappear, and it's gone. And this guy, very familiar with aircraft.
When I was talking about these military encounters, typically what they're encountering is an orb of light, some kind of bright, round, or elliptical shaped object, and that's been going on for years.
The most typical craft that have been reported to me personally have been mostly triangular or mostly lights, just lights in the sky, whether it's orbs or just unnatural formations of lights. That seems to be where we are right now in terms of the amount of reports coming in. A lot of people think that UFO reports have dwindled a lot in the past decade or so. I don't know if it's what that is, what that represents, but there seems to be a decrease in the amount of UFOs being reported. The ones being reported are mostly lights in the sky, I would say.
In the 1800s, it was balloons and wooden ships and that sort of thing. You know, in the 40s and 50s, especially once we started building our jets, they were typically shiny silver craft. When the F-117 came around and the B-2 stealth bomber, now we're getting into black triangular designs. But it's curious that the dimensions, the shape, the color of these craft often mirror where our aviation is at the time.
What's become more apparent in recent years is the bleeding together of various quote-unquote craft shapes and sizes. Small craft are seen gaining mass, while large craft dwindle to small lights that flitter away in the night sky like ashes from a dying fire. All of this points to just one reason why many consider the Phoenix Lights event of 1997 one of the most fascinating cases in recent memory. On March 13th, 1997, between the hours of 7:30 and 10:30 p.m., thousands of people across the city of Phoenix and the surrounding area witnessed a series of lights in a V formation floating across the night sky. The event encompassed a number of descriptives regarding UAPs that helps illustrate just how varied these strange things people are seeing can be.
In 1997, there was an incident called the Phoenix Lights incident, and it's become probably one of the most famous cases in recent UFO history. It involved a large number of people, obviously in the Phoenix area, who reported seeing a massive craft moving through the sky, completely silent.
Many people called, and most people called between 8 and 10 that night because most people were outside looking up at the Hale-Bopp comet at that time. But the mass sighting of anomalous aerial phenomena were not only appearing in Arizona, but starting at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, daylight sightings in Arizona. 5 o'clock hour, they were seen by Native Americans in New Mexico. 7 o'clock hour in California. 11 o'clock hour, they were actually reported by 2 separate airline commercial pilots who reported one of these massive over-mile-wide craft covering Las Vegas.
In his time working with Aerojet, Ron Regier was tasked with multiple classified projects, chief of which was the Defense Support Program, a satellite used to keep a close watch on the airspace above the United States, as well as the rest of the world. In his time involved in the program, he witnessed a number of unusual phenomena detected on the infrared system, including the Phoenix Lights.
The Phoenix Lights, which everybody's heard of, we tracked those from just south of Area 51 down to Tucson.
When you say track them, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, our satellite is in geosynchronous Earth orbits. So it's always looking, and we put 3 of them around the Earth, and that gives us full binary vision coverage of the entire Earth's surface 24/7. Phoenix Lights, we first picked those up just south of Area 51, which is northeast of Las Vegas. Don't know where it originated from, or that's just when it became within our spectrum. It came all the way down past Phoenix and then went down and then went out of sight just north of Tucson.
Do you know how big that was or how big it might have been?
Well, it could be 8 separate objects or it could have been one big object. I don't know.
air traffic controllers at Sky Harbor International Airport. So the same exact thing, took their high-powered binoculars to look, and what they described was 6 equidistant points of light that seemed to be attached to something over a mile wide. But they couldn't quite see what these lights were attached to. And you would hear that again by thousands of people, and they were alarmed because there is a 30-mile radius around the center of the airport called Class B restricted airspace. Anyone that comes into that airspace, especially 1,000 feet altitude that these were, must call into the tower, but no one did.
Often these sightings, the craft or whatever it is, seems to be wanting people to see it. So it's not like people see triangle craft often, but when they do see them, they're often extraordinary circumstances. For instance, you know, you've got the Phoenix lights that happened in 97, and that was a big deal. Governor Fife Symington says he saw those lights, and what he says is taken seriously. He goes as far as to say he believes that they are from somewhere else, that what he saw was a craft from out of this world, essentially.
The last report I received, credible report, personally, was from a Boeing crewman who was coming into work with his crew at 5:30 a.m. the next morning at Sky Harbor International Airport and saw one of these mile-wide craft hovering over their tarmac. So it was for many, many hours, over a dozen hours, and there were many activities happening in many areas at the same time during the mass sighting.
A lot of people don't realize actually that the Phoenix lights were also seen in Nevada and the Vegas area and other regions. So this was a very concentrated wave of sightings that a large number of witnesses saw. And the fascinating thing about that is that, again, we still have no answers.
Now we have really evolved since the 90s to actually looking at the data now that more and more credible people are coming forward, including our own former Arizona governor, who admits that he saw one of these mile-wide craft and that it was otherworldly. And now that Navy pilots are coming forward and sharing that what they're seeing, the technology is so far passes any technology that we have here on Earth that we know about. The whole thing is really evolving to a good place, a much better place of people being ready to learn about the topic and being ready to accept that this is real.
At the turn of the 20th century, it was airships, which became flying saucers, which became cigar-shaped objects, and then triangles and on and on. This is where it was first seen, or they were first seen, the Phoenix lights. The phenomena first appeared in the sky above the Prescott Valley, then moved over the town of Dewey, before finally making its way over the city in the direction of Sky Harbor Airport. It's a sobering thing to come to a place like this and look up into the same sky where something so important happened over 20 years ago. For a lot of witnesses, the event passes and is then forgotten. A string of lights passing in the night, no doubt, was easily forgotten for most people when they're completely unaware that what they're seeing is something extraordinary. But for others like Lynn, it was the beginning. A door opened, she stepped through, and now there won't be any going back. It makes you feel very small to stare up into the sky and wonder if they're still here. And if they are, and you're one of those who catch a glimpse, just what it is, you'll see. Coming up on the next episode of On the Trail of UFOs.
Over the last several weeks, people in this area have been reporting high altitude objects in the sky they're not familiar with.
You'll find that there are areas, particularly in the United States and around the world, that seemingly have a high concentration of sightings. Places like Point Pleasant, West Virginia, or Chestnut Ridge, Sedona.
So the Hudson Valley UFO wave started with the police, and it kind of ended with the police. They actually